The blue diamond weighed 45 carats. It had belonged to kings and been worn by queens who lost their heads. Legends claimed it carried a curse that destroyed everyone who possessed it. Evalyn Walsh McLean owned it for 36 years. She wore it to dinner parties and funerals. She let her Great Dane carry it around the house. She hid it in couch cushions during gatherings and made guests hunt for it, like children searching for Easter eggs. When people warned her about the curse, she laughed and put it on anyway. By the time she died, her 9-year-old son had been struck by a car and killed in front of their home. Her husband had descended into madness, spending his final years in a locked psychiatric ward. Her daughter had overdosed on sleeping pills at 24. The newspaper empire her husband inherited had been sold at auction. The 75-acre estate where presidents once played golf had been demolished to make room for wartime housing. Was the Hope Diamond cursed? Or was Evalyn Walsh McLean simply a woman handed too much money, too young, with no one to teach her what to do with it? Her father would have recognized the danger. Thomas Walsh had arrived in America as a penniless Irish immigrant and spent decades chasing gold before he found it. He understood what sudden wealth could do to people who had not earned it slowly. He built a fortune from nothing and watched his daughter spend it on diamonds and parties and disasters she could not see coming. This is the story of America's last great heiress of the Gilded Age. A woman who bought the most famous jewel in the world and wore it while her life fell apart around her. A woman who fed hungry veterans during the Depression and got swindled out of $100,000 trying to rescue a kidnapped baby. A woman who saw presidents and criminals pass through her drawing room and never learned to tell the difference. She was born in a Colorado mining camp. She died in a Georgetown townhouse with servants who did not know what to do with her jewelry. Everything that happened between those 2 points reads like a cautionary tale about money and madness, and the things we cannot buy, no matter how hard we try. The story begins not with the diamond, but with the gold that paid for it. Chapter 1. Daughter, I've struck it rich. The rock looked worthless. Dull grey, streaked with something that might have been rust. The previous owners had dug tunnels through it searching for silver and found nothing worth keeping. They abandoned their claims and moved on, convinced the mountain had fooled them. Thomas Walsh saw what they had missed. Failure had been his teacher for 2 decades. Colorado had shown him every way a man could lose money chasing precious metal. Other prospectors struck it rich, while Walsh watched from the margins, learning from their luck and his own mistakes. By 1896, when he arrived in Ouray at 46 years old, most men would have surrendered to reality. Walsh had different plans. The abandoned claims in Imogene Basin sat 11,000 feet above sea level. Snow closed the passes for half the year. The men who had worked there before him were hunting silver ore, the obvious bright metal that had made fortunes across the San Juans until the price collapsed in '93. They walked past the grey rock every day without recognizing what it contained. Gold telluride, a compound that looked nothing like the gleaming nuggets most prospectors imagined. The ore was laced with it, hidden in plain sight for years. Walsh bought the claims quietly and worked through the rest of that year in secret. Trusted men helped him confirm his suspicions. Samples were processed away from curious eyes. When certainty replaced hope, he went home to tell his family. His daughter Evalyn was not yet 12 years old. She remembered the moment for the rest of her life, recounting it in her memoir decades later. Her father came through the door with something new in his face, something she had never seen before. He picked her up and spoke 5 words that would shape everything that followed. Daughter, I've struck it rich. The Camp Bird mine took its name from the grey jays that stole food from the workers. Within 2 years, the operation was producing $5,000 in ore every single day. At the turn of the century, that amount would equal roughly $150,000 in modern currency. The wealth accumulated faster than anyone could spend it. Walsh had left Ireland at 19, with nothing but carpentry skills and a sister who shared his ambition. Railroad work came first, then a hotel in Leadville, then marriage to a Kansas schoolteacher named Carrie Bell Reed. Evalyn arrived in 1886, born in a mining town, while her father still chased the dream that had drawn thousands of other men west. Most of those men found only disappointment. Walsh found patience instead. Geology books filled his evenings. Each failure taught him something about where precious metals hid and how to recognize them. While other prospectors rushed from strike to strike, following rumors and luck, Walsh examined abandoned claims that everyone else had given up on. The method required discipline. The discipline eventually paid. By 1900, Camp Bird comprised 103 claims, spread across 941 acres. 12 mills processed the ore around the clock. Walsh employed hundreds of men and treated them better than any mine owner in Colorado, paying top wages and building a boarding house at altitude with electric lighting and porcelain wash basins. When violent labor disputes erupted across the region, Camp Bird remained peaceful. Men who were treated well worked well. Walsh had grown up with nothing. He remembered what that felt like. In 1902, a British syndicate offered to buy him out. The negotiations produced a final price of approximately $5.2 million, paid in cash, ore, and stock. Thomas Walsh had entered Colorado as a penniless immigrant. He left as one of the wealthiest men in America. The family moved to Washington. The capital was where power lived, and Walsh wanted his daughter near it. A mansion would follow, one grand enough to announce their arrival to everyone who mattered. But that construction lay ahead. First came the adjustment to a world where money was no longer a problem. Thomas Walsh died on April 8, 1910. He was 60 years old. His daughter was 23, unmarried, and suddenly one of the richest young women in America. Everything he had built now belonged to her. Chapter 2. The Mansion on Massachusetts Avenue. Workers broke ground near DuPont Circle in the spring of 1901. Over the next 2 years, a mansion rose on Massachusetts Avenue that would become one of the most expensive private residences in the capital's history. Thomas Walsh had hired Henry Anderson, a New York architect known for designing homes that announced their owner's wealth without apology. The brief was straightforward. Build something Washington would not forget. 60 rooms filled the floor plan. The main level held a ballroom with gilded ceilings where Walsh intended to host senators and diplomats. Above it, a private theater allowed the family to entertain guests with performances that never required leaving home. A French salon drew its inspiration from Versailles, though Walsh had never seen Versailles and did not particularly care about French history. The point was impression, not authenticity. The exterior combined Renaissance columns with Baroque curves and Art Nouveau metalwork. Critics who tried to categorize the style gave up and simply called it extravagant. The cost exceeded $800,000 by the time construction finished, a figure that placed it among the most lavish building projects Washington had seen. Stories attached themselves to the house almost immediately. Workers claimed Walsh had hidden a gold nugget somewhere in the foundation, marking the source of his wealth in a place no visitor would ever see. Others said a gold bar was mortared above the main entrance. These details may have been true, or may have been the kind of legends that money attracts. Walsh never confirmed or denied them. The family took possession in the fall of 1903. Evalyn was 17, old enough to understand what the house represented, but young enough to feel bewildered by it. She had spent her childhood watching her father fail and try again across the mining towns of Colorado. Now footmen opened doors for her, and maids laid out dresses that cost more than her father had earned in entire years before the strike. Walsh used the house exactly as he had intended. Presidents visited. Theodore Roosevelt counted Walsh among his friends. King Leopold of Belgium exchanged letters with him about mining investments in the Congo. The carpenter from Tipperary had built himself a palace and filled it with the most powerful people he could attract. 3 years earlier, Walsh had sent his daughter to Paris for voice lessons and cultural refinement. Evalyn had treated the trip as an opportunity for rebellion. She coloured her hair and drank wine at cafes where no one cared about her family's newly acquired respectability. The voice lessons never progressed. The independence she discovered would prove more lasting. Now she stood in a house designed to project exactly the kind of propriety she had already begun to resist. Her father saw the mansion as an arrival. Evalyn saw it as a cage with gilded bars. She was not wrong. But the bars were not the mansions. They were the expectations that came with being the only daughter of one of the richest men in America. The pressure to marry well, the scrutiny of society pages, the assumption that her future had already been decided by her father's success. The house still stands at 2020 Massachusetts Avenue. Indonesia purchased it in 1951 for $335,000 and converted it into their embassy. The ballroom survives. So does the grand staircase. Tourists occasionally photograph the facade without knowing who built it or what became of the daughter who once descended those stairs in gowns she did not choose, toward a future she could not yet see clearly. Chapter 3. The First Tragedy. The automobile was still a novelty in 1905. Wealthy families bought them as toys, racing along country roads at speeds that terrified horses and pedestrians alike. Crashes happened constantly, and without safety features of any kind. The results ranged from embarrassment to death. Evalyn and her brother Vincent were in Newport, Rhode Island that summer. The resort town attracted America's richest families during the warm months, and the Walshes now belonged to that circle. Thomas Walsh had rented a cottage for the season. His children had access to cars. The details of what happened next remain unclear across the historical record. What is certain is that a car carrying both Walsh children crashed. Vincent, not yet 18 years old, did not survive. Evalyn lived, but the impact shattered her leg. Doctors set the bone and prescribed morphine for the pain. The relief was immediate and total. Evalyn kept taking the drug long after the bones had healed, and within months she had developed a dependency that would follow her for years. She was 19 years old. Her only brother was dead. Her body was broken, and she had discovered a substance that made grief feel distant and manageable. Thomas Walsh buried his son and watched his daughter struggle with an addiction he did not fully understand. Dependency on opiates was common in this era, often beginning exactly as Evalyn's had, with legitimate prescriptions for legitimate pain. Doctors did not yet grasp how quickly the drug could take hold. Patients who tried to stop discovered withdrawal symptoms that made continued use feel like the only option. The family did not discuss Vincent's death publicly. The Walsh mansion on Massachusetts Avenue continued to host dinners and receptions. Evalyn appeared at social functions with her leg still healing and her pupils occasionally betraying what she had taken to get through the evening. Her father tried treatments, sanitariums, specialists, gradual reduction programs that Evalyn abandoned when the discomfort became unbearable. The morphine offered something she could not find elsewhere. a buffer between herself and a world that had just demonstrated how quickly everything could disappear. Vincent had been her companion through the uncertain years before wealth arrived. Now she stood alone as the only surviving Walsh child, heir to a fortune she had never asked for, carrying damage both visible and hidden. The leg healed imperfectly. Evalyn would walk with a slight limp for the rest of her life. The addiction proved harder to treat. She would struggle with opiates and later with alcohol, cycling through periods of sobriety and relapse. The pattern established in 1905 never fully released her. 5 years later, her father would be dead. But first, Evalyn Walsh would meet a young man from another wealthy family. A man with his own demons. A man who would give her access to even more money and even more ways to destroy herself. His name was Edward Beale McLean. His friends called him Ned. His family owned the Washington Post. Chapter 4. The Golden Couple. Edward Beale McLean came from the kind of family that made the Walshes look like newcomers. John Roll McLean owned the Washington Post and the Cincinnati Enquirer. The McLeans had wielded influence in the capital for decades, long before Thomas Walsh struck gold in Colorado. Ned, as everyone called him, was handsome and charming, and completely unequipped for adult life. He had been given everything except responsibility. Drinking came easily. So did spending. He moved through Washington's social scene with the confidence of someone who had never faced consequences for anything. Evalyn recognized a version of herself. They were both heirs who had never learned to earn anything. They were both dulling private pain with substances, Ned with alcohol and Evalyn with morphine. Together, they could be honest about their weaknesses in ways neither could manage alone. Thomas Walsh saw the danger immediately. So did John McLean. Two young people with unlimited resources and limited self-control, drawn together by mutual recklessness. The objections only made the romance more appealing. In July of 1908, Evalyn and Ned eloped. They married in Denver, far from both families and the Washington press that would have turned their wedding into spectacle. Evalyn was 22. Ned was 23. Between them, they would eventually control assets worth hundreds of millions in today's currency. The honeymoon lasted nearly a year. Europe first, then Turkey and Egypt. They spent without counting, and no one refused them anything. In Paris, Evalyn saw a diamond that stopped her mid-sentence. The Star of the East weighed 94 carats. It hung from a chain of smaller stones, a pear-shaped diamond so large it seemed artificial. The dealer wanted $120,000. Ned paid. Evalyn wore it that evening. She would wear it for decades, often pairing it with other stones that would have been the centerpiece of any normal collection. The Star of the East was merely her first great diamond. It would not be the most famous. The purchase established a pattern. When Evalyn wanted something, Ned provided it. When Ned wanted to drink, Evalyn looked away. They enabled each other with silent efficiency. The marriage was not happy in any conventional sense, but it functioned on terms they both accepted. They returned to Washington in 1909 as one of the wealthiest young couples in America. Both families had accepted the union, if not celebrated it. The Walsh properties and the McLean newspapers now formed a single empire. Thomas Walsh died the following April. His health had declined since Vincent's death, and some who knew him believed he never recovered from burying his son. Everything passed to Evalyn, joining what Ned would eventually inherit. The golden couple now had mansions, newspapers, diamonds, and each other. What they lacked was any idea what to do with it all. Chapter 5. The Hope Diamond. Pierre Cartier understood that selling to the very wealthy required more than gemology. It required narrative. In the winter of 1910, Cartier invited Evalyn Walsh McLean to view a stone he had recently acquired. The diamond was a blue so deep it seemed to hold darkness inside it. 45 carats. He could have described its clarity and cut. Instead, he told her about the curse. The stone had been stolen from a Hindu idol in India centuries ago, he explained. A French merchant named Tavernier brought it to Europe and was later torn apart by wild dogs. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette possessed it before the guillotine claimed them. Since then, the diamond had passed through the hands of an Amsterdam cutter murdered by his own son, a Greek owner who drove off a cliff, a Russian prince who shot the mistress he had given it to, and a sultan who lost both his throne and his sanity. Everyone who touched this diamond, Cartier concluded, met with disaster. Evalyn was not frightened. She was fascinated. A brother already dead. A car crash that left her with a permanent limp and a morphine habit. Misfortune held no terror for someone who had already met it. If anything, the curse made the diamond more interesting, more personal. Cartier named his price, $180,000. Evalyn left without buying, but she could not stop thinking about it. Weeks passed. She returned. The sale closed on January 28, 1911. The contract reportedly included an unusual clause allowing her to return the diamond if any family member died within a specified period. Much of Cartier's curse was invention. Tavernier had not been killed by dogs. He died in Russia at 84, wealthy and respected. The connection to Marie Antoinette was tenuous. The stone she supposedly possessed was the French blue, a larger diamond from which the hope was later cut. The tales of murdered cutters and suicidal Greeks came from newspaper articles that valued drama over accuracy. None of this mattered to Evalyn. She had purchased a legend as much as a gemstone. The Hope diamond gave her a story that belonged to her alone. She treated it like a toy. Her Great Dane carried it around the house in his mouth. During parties, she hid it in sofa cushions and made guests search for it. At dinners and funerals alike, the blue stone hung from her neck. When reporters asked about the curse, she smiled and said bad luck objects were lucky for her. The diamond became inseparable from her identity. Evalyn Walsh McLean, the woman who laughed at curses. Within 8 years, her 9-year-old son would be dead. Chapter 6. Friendship. The estate covered 75 acres along Wisconsin Avenue. Evalyn and Ned purchased it shortly after their marriage and hired John Russell Pope to design the main residence. Pope would later create the Jefferson Memorial and the National Gallery of Art. Friendship was a different kind of commission. The house sprawled across grounds that included formal gardens, stables, and a golf course where powerful men could conduct business away from public eyes. Guests arrived to find orchestras on the lawn and tables heavy with food that most Americans saw only in photographs. Prohibition meant nothing here. Ned McLean owned newspapers. He knew which officials to cultivate. The law stopped at the property line. Evalyn presided over these gatherings with the Hope diamond at her throat. Hostess to senators and ambassadors. Gatekeeper to a world where an invitation to friendship determined who mattered in Washington. Warren Harding was a regular visitor before he reached the White House. He and Ned shared an enthusiasm for poker, whiskey, and avoiding serious conversation. When Harding won the election in 1920, the McLeans believed they had secured access to the presidency itself. They were not wrong. Harding visited Friendship during his time in office. He used the McLean golf course while aides waited and senators angled for his attention. Dinners mixed politics with pleasure in ways that would later seem reckless. The McLeans had achieved what few families managed, a sitting president treating their home as an extension of his own. Alice Roosevelt Longworth moved through the same circles, but watched with colder eyes. Teddy Roosevelt's daughter had grown up in the actual White House. She understood that proximity to power was not the same as possessing it. Alice collected secrets the way Evalyn collected jewels, and she remembered everything. Decades afterward, Alice described the Harding administration with contempt, a betrayal of her father's legacy. She recalled Ned drinking his way through evenings, while his newspapers printed whatever the administration wanted. She saw Evalyn mistake wealth for influence, visibility for respect. But such judgments belonged to a later era. In 1918 and 1919, friendship seemed untouchable. The McLeans entertained congressmen and cabinet members. Their son Vincent, 9 years old, ran across the same grounds where senators strolled. The estate represented everything the family had accumulated: wealth, connections, visibility. Then, in May of 1919, a car struck Vincent on Wisconsin Avenue, just beyond the gates of the property his parents had built to keep the world at bay. The Harding years still lay ahead. The scandals and the losses had barely begun. But Evalyn Walsh McLean would host every party that followed as a woman who had already buried her only son. Chapter 7. The Death of Vincent. The newspapers reported it as a tragic accident. A child darting into the road. A driver who could not stop in time. The kind of loss that struck families everywhere, wealthy and poor alike. But Evalyn Walsh McLean was not every mother. She owned the most famous cursed jewel in the world, and the public had not forgotten what Cartier had said about everyone who possessed it. Condolence letters arrived at Friendship after the funeral. So did other messages, darker ones. Strangers wrote to inform Evalyn that her son's death proved the stone carried evil. Ministers she had never met urged her to sell it before another victim fell. Newspapers that had once celebrated her parties now speculated openly about whether she had brought this suffering upon herself. Evalyn did not respond. She did not sell. In her memoir, written decades later, she addressed the accusations directly. If the hope carried a curse, she argued, then it had been cursed long before she bought it. Bad luck objects, she insisted, were lucky for her. The logic made no sense. It was not supposed to make sense. It was the reasoning of a woman who refused to let the world see her break. At her son's funeral, the blue stone hung from her neck. At dinners, in the months that followed, it hung there still. She would not remove it. To do so would mean admitting that the gossips and ministers and strangers were right, that she had somehow caused her own child's death by refusing to fear a legend. Grief found other outlets. The morphine dependency she had carried since 1905 deepened. Alcohol joined it. Ned was drinking heavily, and Evalyn matched him. The parties at Friendship continued. The guest lists remained impressive. The orchestras played on. Stopping would require acknowledging that something had broken. None of it brought Vincent back. His bedroom sat empty. His name became something guests learned not to speak. Evalyn's brother had died in a car accident 14 years earlier. Now her firstborn son had died the same way. The pattern seemed designed by something cruel. Wealth offered no shield. The finest doctors, the largest estate, the most powerful friends in Washington, all of it meant nothing against a car moving too fast and a boy in the wrong place. She continued wearing the stone for another 28 years. When Evalyn Walsh McLean died in 1947, it was still around her neck. She had insisted to the end that it brought her luck. The evidence suggested otherwise, but evidence had never been the point. Chapter 8. power and scandal. The lie was simple. Ned McLean told a United States Senate committee that he had personally loaned $100,000 to Albert Fall, the Secretary of the Interior. The loan explained where Fall had gotten the money to improve his New Mexico ranch. It had nothing to do with oil leases or government contracts or bribery. That testimony, delivered under oath, held for several weeks before it fell apart. Albert Fall had indeed received $100,000, but not from Ned McLean. The money came from Edward Doheny, an oil magnate who had been granted drilling rights on federal land at Elk Hills, California. Additional payments, totaling over $400,000 in cash and bonds, came from Harry Sinclair, who received leases at a Wyoming oil reserve called Teapot Dome. Fall had sold access to public resources for private profit. The scandal would eventually send him to prison, the first cabinet member in American history convicted of crimes committed while in office. Ned had tried to provide cover for a man who had attended his parties, used his golf course, enjoyed his hospitality during the years when the McLean name still opened doors. The favor cost him everything except a cell. Senator Thomas Walsh of Montana led the investigation. He shared a surname with Evalyn's father, but no blood relation. For months, Walsh methodically dismantled the alibis and cover stories that Fall and his allies had constructed. When Ned's perjury surfaced, Walsh made certain every newspaper in the country reported it. Ned owned the Washington Post. He had spent years using it to cultivate powerful allies and shield them from scrutiny. Now his own publication had to report that its publisher had lied to Congress. The humiliation was complete. Evalyn watched her husband's reputation disintegrate. She knew he was reckless. She had seen him drink through dinners, while senators laughed at his jokes and accepted his hospitality. The relationships they had built were transactional, dependent on what the McLeans could provide rather than any genuine bond. What surprised her was the speed of abandonment. The same men who had visited Friendship, who had treated the McLean estate as their private retreat, now refused to return calls. Loyalty, it turned out, was another commodity that required constant payment. Ned was never prosecuted. Perjury charges require proof of intent, and his lawyers successfully argued that their client was too foolish to have knowingly deceived anyone. The defense was accurate and devastating. Edward Beale McLean, heir to a newspaper fortune, publisher of 2 major papers, was officially too stupid to be held accountable for his own words. He disappeared into alcohol. The habit that had always troubled him now became his sole occupation. Evalyn managed what remained of their public life, hosting events Ned could no longer attend sober, keeping up appearances that fooled no one who looked closely. She had survived her son's death. She would survive her husband's disgrace. The question was whether anything worth preserving would remain when the surviving was done. Chapter 9. The Lindbergh Scam. Gaston means made his living from crisis, detective, government agent, fixer for men who needed problems to disappear. The Bureau of Investigation had fired him for corruption. A fraud charge had already put him behind bars once. None of this prevented him from finding new victims. People in pain rarely check references. In March of 1932, the entire nation was in pain. Charles Lindbergh had become the most famous man in the world 5 years earlier when he flew solo across the Atlantic. His infant son, 20 months old, had been taken from the family home in New Jersey on the 1st of March. Ransom notes demanded $50,000. Weeks passed without resolution. Means saw opportunity. He approached Evalyn Walsh McLean with a tale perfectly calibrated to her weaknesses. He knew people, he told her. Underworld contacts who moved in circles the police could never penetrate. The kidnappers trusted him. For the right price, he could negotiate the boy's return and spare the Lindbergh family further agony. Evalyn was wealthy, generous to the point of recklessness, and carrying grief of her own. She understood what the Lindberghs must be suffering. She also wanted redemption. Teapot Dome had made the McLean name synonymous with scandal. Here was a chance to be remembered for something heroic. She handed over $100,000 in cash, then $4,000 more for expenses. The bills disappeared. Weeks of excuses followed. The kidnappers had moved locations, means explained. New intermediaries were needed. The situation required patience. Each delay bought time while Evalyn waited for news that would never arrive. On May 12th, a truck driver found remains in woods several miles from the Lindbergh home. The boy had likely died the night he was taken. Every dollar Evalyn had given Means purchased nothing but lies. Means was arrested and charged with larceny. At trial, he insisted his account was true. With the certainty of a man who had deceived so many people, he could no longer locate the boundary between invention and fact. The jury deliberated briefly. 15 years in federal prison. The $104,000 was never recovered. Means claimed he had passed it to intermediaries. Investigators believed he had hidden it somewhere, planning to retrieve the cash after release. He died in Leavenworth in 1938, and if the money still existed, its location went with him. Evalyn had handed a fortune to a known criminal because his version of events matched what she wanted to believe. During the worst years of the Depression, that sum could have sustained 100 families for a year. The newspapers covered the trial eagerly. The McLean name appeared in headlines again and again for reasons that brought shame rather than honor. In interviews afterward, Evalyn refused to call it humiliation. She framed the loss as the price of trying to help. The child had been beyond saving before she ever wrote a check. That did not mean the effort was worthless. She moved on to the next crisis. There would be no shortage of them. Chapter 10. The Bonus Army. They arrived by freight train, by truck, by foot. Thousands of men who had served in France 15 years earlier promised a bonus, now broke. The certificates Congress had issued in 1924 would mature in 1945. Waiting 13 more years was not possible. Hunger does not wait. By June of 1932, more than 20,000 had gathered in Washington. The Bonus Expeditionary Force, they called themselves, a bitter echo of the American Expeditionary Force that had shipped them overseas to fight Germany. Empty government buildings became shelters. Shanties rose along the Anacostia River. Families arrived. A small city of desperation took shape within sight of the Capitol Dome. Congress debated their petition. The House passed a bill for early payment. The Senate rejected it. No one left. Evalyn Walsh McLean read about them in the papers her husband nominally owned. The coverage described vagrants, agitators, potential revolutionaries. Hoover saw the encampment as a threat to order. Respectable Washington wanted them gone. Evalyn drove to the camp. What she found were men who looked like the workers her father had employed at Camp Bird decades earlier. Weathered faces, calloused hands. The exhaustion of people who had labored their entire lives and been discarded. These were not revolutionaries. These were Americans who had been told their sacrifice mattered and had learned it did not. She ordered 1,000 sandwiches, coffee, cigarettes. The supplies arrived while men in threadbare uniforms stared at the woman in expensive clothes. Some recognized her name from the society pages. Most simply ate. She returned the next day, and the day after that. The papers noted her visits with the same bemused tone they used for all her eccentricities. The woman with the cursed diamond was feeding hobos. Good copy. On July 28th, the order came. General Douglas MacArthur, Army Chief of Staff, led infantry and cavalry down Pennsylvania Avenue. Major George Patton commanded the tanks. The soldiers carried bayonets and gas masks. The marchers assumed the troops would stop. Many had served alongside men just like these. Some had commanded them. The army would not attack its own. The army attacked. Tear gas filled the Anacostia camp. Soldiers advanced with fixed bayonets. The shanties burned. Families fled with whatever they could carry. By nightfall, the bonus army had been driven from Washington. 2 men were dead from police gunfire earlier in the day. Hundreds more were injured. MacArthur told reporters he had saved the nation from revolution. The administration defended the action as necessary. The survivors scattered back to the poverty they had briefly escaped. Evalyn watched the smoke rise from across the river. She had fed them sandwiches while the government prepared to burn their shelters. Her generosity had changed nothing concrete. Their service had purchased nothing lasting. The system that had made her wealthy had no place for men whose utility had expired in the trenches. She owned the Hope Diamond. They held paper redeemable in 13 years. The distance between those facts said more about 1932 than any editorial could. Chapter 11. The Final Years. The Washington Post went at auction on June 1st, 1933. Eugene Meyer, a financier with political ambitions, paid $825,000. 4 years earlier, Ned McLean had refused an offer of $5 million. The newspaper his father had built into one of the most influential in the capital fetched less than 1/6 of that rejected price. Ned was not present. He was no longer capable of managing his own affairs. 5 months later, a court declared him legally insane. The proceedings were not contested. Everyone who knew Ned understood that alcohol and instability had finally overwhelmed whatever remained of his judgment. He was committed to Shepherd and Enoch Pratt Hospital in Baltimore, a psychiatric institution where wealthy families placed relatives they could no longer control or conceal. Evalyn visited when she could bear it. The man in the ward bore little resemblance to the charming, reckless husband she had eloped with 25 years earlier. Ned had become a patient, managed by doctors, confined to grounds he could not leave. The newspapers that had once printed his name in society columns now reported his institutionalization as another chapter in the McLean decline. She continued hosting gatherings at Friendship, though the estate was shrinking. Debts had forced the disposal of portions of the property. The golf course where presidents had played was gone. The grounds that had once sprawled across 75 acres contracted year by year as creditors claimed what they were owed. In 1941, Ned suffered a fatal heart attack in the hospital. He was 56 years old. Evalyn buried him and continued. There was nothing else to do. The war came and went. Friendship itself was purchased by the federal government in 1942 for wartime housing. The estate where Evalyn had entertained Harding and fed the bonus army was demolished. Apartment buildings rose in its place. McLean Gardens, the development was called. The name was all that remained. Evalyn moved to a townhouse in Georgetown, smaller rooms, fewer servants. The Hope Diamond still hung from her neck at dinners, though the dinners were quieter now and the guest lists shorter. Her daughter had married Robert Reynolds Jr., son of a North Carolina senator. The marriage produced no happiness. In September of 1946, the younger Evalyn was found dead from an overdose of sleeping pills. She was 24 years old. Evalyn Walsh McLean had now buried a brother, a son, a husband, and a daughter. The diamond that supposedly carried a curse had presided over all of it, worn at funerals and hospital visits and quiet evenings, where an aging woman sat with her jewelry and her memories. 7 months after losing her daughter, Evalyn developed pneumonia. She died on April 26, 1947. She was 60 years old. The estate she left behind was a tangle of debts and possessions. Her surviving children lacked the means to maintain what remained. In 1949, the family transferred her jewelry collection to Harry Winston, a New York dealer who specialized in famous stones. Winston displayed the Hope Diamond for years, touring it around the country for charity events. He understood its power as spectacle. In November of 1958, he made a decision that Evalyn would have found incomprehensible. He gave the diamond to the Smithsonian Institution. Winston sent it through the United States Mail, first-class registered, insured for $1 million. The postage cost $2.44. The most famous diamond in the world arrived at the museum in a brown paper package. It remains there today. Visitors line up to see the blue stone that once belonged to kings and heiresses, that supposedly destroyed everyone who owned it, that hung from Evalyn Walsh McLean's neck while her family fell apart around her one death at a time. The display case offers no verdict on whether any curse was real. It simply presents the diamond, 45.52 carats of crystallized carbon, beautiful and silent about everything it witnessed.